got something special. As we talk about going to our future, we have to know where we're at. And we have Scott Graves joining us again this year to give us a state budget update. Scott is the Director of Research for the California Budget Center. He oversees the Budget Center's analytical work. He conducts research and analysis related to the health and human services field, and he is the organization's lead analyst on the state and county budget processes. Scott always comes to make the state budget simple for us to understand. Scott, welcome again this year. Thanks for joining us, and I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jordan. Just double checking, you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for inviting me back to this annual conference. I think you only missed 1 year due to COVID, totally understandable. I'm really happy to join you over the internet someday. I hope we can go back to in-person presentations with an opportunity for folks to zoom in if they want to. So maybe at some point in the future, we'll be able to do that and we'll be able to see each other in person again. This actually isn't going to be a run-of-the-mill budget presentation this morning because this is not a run-of-the-mill state fiscal year. Instead, like a previously dormant volcano that has rumbled back to life, California's little-known spending cap, which is also known as the GAN limit, is this year and in future years will be limiting our state leaders' decisions about how to spend tax dollars through the state budget. So the fact that the GAN limit or the spending cap has sprung back to life is going to impact all advocates' budget strategies, not only this year, but also in years to come. So it's really critical for advocates to understand what the GAN limit is, what it means for their budget asks, and what it means for California's future. We at the Budget Center are very worried about the GAN limit, and so we have been doing our best to educate advocates this year about this spending cap and what it means for California and for advocates' budget asks, as they're called here in Sacramento. So the GAN limit is the biggest thing happening in the state budget this year. It's the biggest constraint on the decisions that our state leaders can make in the state capitol, both Governor Newsom and all 120 state legislators. So what I wanted to do this morning was to take a little time to talk about the GAN limit and do really three things in this presentation. First, I want to review what the GAN limit is and what it does. Second, I want to explain why it's a major problem for California. And finally, I want to point towards some directions that we can take to solve this problem over the next couple of years. So that's my goal. I'm going to try to keep this as non-wonky and non-technical as possible, but I will warn you, this is a very complex area. It's in the state constitution, but I'm going to do my best to keep things at a high level, and maybe toward the end we'll have time for some questions. Even if we don't have questions this morning, I want everyone to know that you should feel free to contact me at the California Budget and Policy Center if you have any questions or concerns at all about the GAN limit, what it means for your budget asks this year or in the years to come, or really any other budget related questions you may have. The Budget Center is here to help you. So the first place we always like to start when we talk about the budget is to remember that everything goes back to the state budget because it reflects our values and priorities as Californians. Every year, state budgets answer the question, what kind of California do we want to live in? We know that Californians want affordable health care, housing, childcare, and the list goes on. To make that happen, state leaders need the flexibility to make budget and policy choices that benefit all of us, not just some Californians. But the GAN limit is holding us back because it restricts budget choices and blocks efforts to build a California where everyone can be healthy and thrive. So first, let's turn here toward the origins of the GAN limit and how it works so that we're all on the same page. The GAN limit goes back to 1979, so we've got to go, back in time 43 years, when Proposition 4 was put on the ballot and the voters approved it as a constitutional amendment. So Proposition 4, or the GAN limit, really emerged from the anti-tax movement of the 1970s. The reason it's called the GAN limit is because its major proponent was Paul Gann, who also was one of the authors of Proposition 13, the world famous property tax limitation measure that voters passed the year before in 1978. Even despite the passage of Prop 13, Paul Gann felt that they didn't go far enough to limit government spending in California. So he came back a year later in a special election with the GAN limit in an effort, basically a second bite of the apple in order to further limit government spending in California. It's important to realize that the GAN limit was approved during a period of major demographic change in California. White Californians' share of the state population was falling pretty dramatically. White Californians made up around 3/4 of the state's population in 1970. By 1980, that had dropped to about 2/3. So the GAN limit was coming at the tail end of the 1970s. And it was a period when research shows that white Californians' commitment to robust public services, including education, but not just limited to education, was beginning to erode as the state was becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. And just for your information, today, white Californians make up less than 40% of Californians' 40 million residents today. So that white share of the population has continued to fall as California has become a much more diverse state in the ensuing decades. So before we get a little bit into the weeds, I wanted everybody to understand the big picture on the GAN limit. So the first point to know about the GAN limit is that it is a spending cap that applies to both the state and to local government. So we all live probably in cities, we all live in counties. If we have kids, they're in school districts. So when we say it applies to local governments, that means cities, counties, special districts, K-12 school districts, community college districts. They all have their own GAN limits that are calculated based on formulas in the state constitution. The second thing to know about the GAN limit is that it is intended to keep inflation-adjusted per person spending under the 1978-79 levels. And finally, the GAN limit is really intended to enshrine in our state's constitution the budget priorities of the late 1970s. So it's essentially that generation in the late 1970s deciding that they wanted their priorities for the state, for spending, for what public policy should look like, to stretch far into the future. That is the ultimate goal of the GAN limit. So I wanted to dig a little bit or go a little bit further into the weeds, but not too far on the GAN limit, so everybody has sort of a general understanding of how it actually operates. So at the highest level, what the GAN limit is doing is, based on a formula in the state constitution, it's drawing a line. It's an arbitrary line, and that line is the state's spending limit. Then we look at whether revenues, after subtracting certain types of spending that can be excluded, and that's really important, and I'll come back to that in a bit, but we look at whether revenues exceed that arbitrary line across 2 consecutive fiscal years. So there's 2 really important things going on there in that sentence. The first is the concept of excluded spending, which, as I said, I'll come back to. The second thing is that we have to go over the line 2 years in a row. So it's not just enough to say, oh, we went over the line this year, so we have a problem. It's, are we going over the line for 2 consecutive fiscal years? That's what actually matters for the GAN limit. If we do go over the line over 2 consecutive fiscal years, then we have what are called excess revenues, quote unquote. excess revenues. Now, we may not think they're excessive, right? I mean, they could be used for something positive to help improve the lives of Californians with developmental disabilities, for example. But in the eyes of the GAN limit, those revenues aren't really needed. They are excessive. So what do you do with excess revenues? Well, you split them 50-50. Policymakers don't get to decide how to allocate the revenues that go beyond the line. So what does the 50-50 split look like? Well, first, 50% of the excess revenues, quote unquote, go back to taxpayers in some way as determined by the legislature. The other half go to K-14 education, meaning K-12 schools and community colleges, on a per pupil basis. So a per pupil basis means all school districts would receive the same amount per student, even though, as we know, there are many school districts where students have higher needs and where the districts therefore need more revenue in order to ensure that they're meeting those needs and making sure that all students can have positive educational outcomes. So the GAN limit, in terms of the part of the excess revenues that go out to school districts, would go out on an inequitable basis because they wouldn't take into account the inequities built into our society and our educational system. So that's how the GAN limit works at a really high level. What I want to do now is walk you through 4 charts that will hopefully make this all a little less abstract. We'll see if I succeed, and you can tell me later whether I've succeeded or not. So first, let's assume in our hypothetical world that California is going to receive $200 billion in revenues that count toward the GAN limit. This is not taking into account any exclusions. We're making up this world where we say, hey, we're going to have $200 billion coming in. Now, I say count toward the GAN limit because there are some types of revenues that don't count, and I'm not going to get into that detail, but we're assuming here an even $200 billion that count toward the GAN limit. Okay, so the next question we have to ask is, well, that's fine, but what is our spending cap? Well, let's assume that the constitutional formula results in a spending cap that is set at $100 billion. So you're maybe looking at this, scratching your head going, wait a minute, the spending cap is $100 billion. We have $200 billion in revenues. Haven't we blown way past the spending cap? How does that work? Well, that is a very good question. And this is where the concept of excluded spending comes in, right? The GAN limit says that some types of spending does not get counted toward the limit. And to give you like a preview on that, a couple of examples would be spending for an emergency or spending on infrastructure. Those types of things, the GAN limit says, spend as much as you want. I don't care. So if policymakers in our next example manage to get under the limit, here's how they would do it. Assume out of that $200 billion, our state leaders manage to exclude $110 billion in revenues, right? So $200 billion minus 110 gets you to $90 billion. If your cap is $100 billion, that means you are $10 billion under the GAN limit that year, and you have what is called here in Sacramento room, quote unquote. So if you ever hear anyone talking about, is there room under the limit, this is what they mean, is countable spending underneath the arbitrary line that the GAN limit draws. In this case, it is. We're under by $10 billion. Now, what about a situation where we don't manage to get under the limit? Well, I'm going to show you that next. In the other scenario, policymakers only managed to exclude $90 billion. So again, we started with 200 in revenues, 200 billion. If we subtract 90 from that, we're at 110 billion. But remember, we said our cap is 100 billion. So the dark orange portion of this chart is showing that we are $10 billion over the GAN limit for this particular year. If that happened again, if in the next fiscal year, we also were over the GAN limit, then we would have a situation where we have excess revenues, and they would have to go out on the 50-50 basis that I told you about earlier, half back to taxpayers and half to K-14 education. So I hope that made the concept of the GAN limit a little less abstract. I've been wrestling with it for the last year, and there are still many things about it that are mystifying to me. So I would have no doubt if many of you are out there, I can't see your faces, of course, but you may be scratching your heads going, I'm still not quite sure about this. That's perfectly fine. We're all still struggling with it because there are so many complexities and nuances to the GAN limit. But hopefully these charts help to give you a little more insight into how it works at a relatively high level. So I wanted to talk about a couple of the negative aspects of the GAN limit before I move into what policymakers can do about it and what we as voters can do about it. So there are a couple of ways in which the GAN limit constrains our ability to make investments through the state budget in California. Really, this applies to both current services and bold policy solutions. So let's start with current services. The first thing to remember is that spending for many state services does count toward the GAN limit, right? Cannot be excluded. And we know the cost of those services, for example, things like supports for seniors and people with disabilities, can actually go up faster than the GAN limit is allowed to rise each year by the formulas built into the state constitution. So that potentially sets up a situation where overall spending on current services could ultimately exceed the GAN limit, and if so, those services would face cuts. In other words, the baseline costs of the services would be going over the limit. That would mean that some portion of those services could not be paid for with the excess revenues. Therefore, we would see cuts to current services, and it would be up to policymakers to decide how to apportion those cuts. The other place where we run into trouble with the GAN limit is that it blocks bold policies, right? So let's say you have an idea for a policy solution that's going to cost quite a bit of money, and you say, well, let's go to the taxpayers and ask them if they will raise their taxes or someone's taxes in order to pay for our great new policy idea. Well, the problem with that is if the revenues that you're raising push the state revenue stream overall beyond the GAN limit, in other words, the revenues go above the limit, you don't get to spend those revenues on the policy idea that you put before the voters. And that is because revenues that go above the GAN limit can only be spent in a few narrow ways that are allowed by the GAN limit within the state constitution. So what that does is that puts at risk efforts to make big investments in things like childcare, healthcare, public health, supports for people with disabilities, the whole list here. And actually the list is much more than I'm able to include on this slide. So essentially, the GAN limit puts at risk both our ability to fund baseline current services, as well as our ability to make bold investments that just go beyond the status quo, because the GAN limit, by definition, limits our ability to use revenues that go above the arbitrary spending cap. Okay, I also wanted to highlight here the fact that the GAN limit does not exist in a vacuum. I think many of you are well aware that the voters have been asked to make lots of changes to our state constitution over the years, and we, the people, have put very significant budget formulas in our state constitution. And so there are two major budget formulas that I wanted to highlight for you now that voters have approved since the passage of the GAN limit back in 1979. So the first one is Proposition 98. This is very well known in California. Even if you're not dealing with Prop 98 directly, you've probably heard of it one way or another if you're dealing with the state budget. Essentially, Prop 98 just guarantees a minimum annual level of funding for K-12 schools and community colleges. So that is a very significant budget formula that was put into our state constitution back in 1988. And the second major one I want to tell you about is Proposition 2. This was a ballot measure that was put on a statewide ballot by the legislature back in 2014. The voters approved it. And essentially, this requires the state to build up its main budget reserve, which is called the Budget Stabilization Account. And it also requires us to pay down certain types of debts every year. So it's basically telling state leaders, you don't get to spend every penny that comes in. Some of it has to be set aside in a reserve for a rainy day, and some of it has to be used to pay down various types of debt that have accumulated, including unfunded liabilities for the state's pension systems. That's an example of one of the debts that could be paid down. So, important thing to keep in mind here is that when the GAN limit is in effect, as it is this year, right, the state has to meet all three of these obligations at the same time. So it's not just about meeting the GAN limit, it's also about meeting the requirements of Prop 98 and the requirements of Prop 2. So they are all requiring us to do things, and they are essentially working at cross purposes. And this is where things get really complicated really quickly. I'm going to do my best to explain it through the next slide, but there may still be questions, and you should feel free to ask me if there's time today or follow up with me later. But this gets relatively complicated. The bottom line is that by complying with all three of these formulas, funding for services outside of K-14 education is threatened. This is a very real possibility, not this year, but next year, the year after, and the year after that. People in the Capitol are very worried about this impact. So here's what's happening. Imagine this. I already told you that every dollar that goes above the spending cap has to apply or comply with the requirements of the GAN limit. Also, though, about 60 cents of every dollar that goes above the cap has to meet Prop 98 or Prop 2 requirements. Now, keep in mind, these are the same dollars that are already claimed by the GAN limit, so to speak. So the GAN limit says, hey, every dollar that goes above the cap, you have to use it as I say. And Prop 98 says, hey, about 40 cents on every dollar that goes over the cap, you have to use it as I say. And Prop 2 says about 20 cents of every dollar over the cap, you have to use it as I say. So they're all basically operating on the same money, right? So what this means is the state would owe more to these three formulas than the total amount of revenues that exceed the spending cap. So sometimes the way this gets boiled down is for every dollar that comes in above the spending cap, we owe through the state budget $1.60. Imagine that. You have a dollar coming in, and yet you owe $1.60 to these constitutional obligations. How does that work? How do they address that? Well, what happens is you have to find a way to pay for those obligations. Where are you going to find that money? Well, in some cases, the state may have various cushions of revenues, discretionary revenues that they can access to sort of offset some of this problem, but that's not going to solve it entirely. What you end up with is a situation where you could see cuts to services outside of schools and community colleges, right? The services that do not have constitutional protection, they would get less money, or they could be cut in order to find the money that is required to pay the obligations of Prop 2, of Prop 98, and of the GAN limit. So again, I cannot see my audience. I don't know how many of you are rolling your eyes right now or wondering, what is this guy talking about? I hope I've done at least a halfway decent job of trying to get across to you that the interaction of these three budget formulas is not good for the state's fiscal situation. And we end up with a situation where even if we have great revenue years, right? We're not even talking about going into a recession. It's just if revenues keep coming in higher than expected, the state faces a dismal budget outlook because we do not get to spend those dollars in the ways needed to support public services in California. We have to spend them the way all of these obligations are telling us to spend them, including the GAN limit. So what are the options for responding here, at least in the short term? Okay, so this year and in any year, policymakers basically have two major options. The first thing they can do is just do nothing, right? They can forecast revenues coming in higher than expected. They can let those revenues accumulate and then split them 50-50 between taxpayers and schools and community colleges, as I mentioned earlier. So that's the basic 50-50 split that's envisioned in the state constitution. But the GAN limit also provides another opportunity, a different way that policymakers can respond. And what this is really is they, meaning legislators and the governor, can take preemptive action to avoid exceeding the GAN limit. In other words, they can look ahead, right? They're always forecasting. What are the revenues likely to be this year and then the year to follow? And then they compare that to the GAN limit and they see, oh, wow, it looks like we're going to go 20 billion over the GAN limit. Maybe we don't want to do that this year. Maybe we want to have some narrow discretion over how we spend the dollars that would otherwise go beyond the limit, but we're not going to let those dollars go beyond the limit. So what does this mean? How can they avoid going beyond the limit by taking preemptive action? One thing they can do is they can spend more on things that are excluded from the GAN limit. So this would be, like I mentioned earlier, something like infrastructure. This is what's known as qualified capital outlay, and responding to an emergency. So for example, the governor's COVID-19 state of emergency from March 2020 remains in effect today. Policies and expenditures that address that emergency, the cost of them can be excluded from the GAN limit. In other words, not count toward the state's spending cap. Another thing that the state can do is we can reduce revenue, right? So one way to do that is to expand tax credits, like the state's earned income tax credit, known as the Cal EITC, and the young child tax credit. This is a way to get dollars out to families with low incomes to help them meet their basic needs. And also, since it's scored as a revenue reduction, that helps with the state's GAN limit problem, right? Because if you have fewer revenues being scored as coming into the Treasury, then that makes it that much less likely that you're going to go over the GAN limit. And then finally, they can actually do both of these things, right? Policymakers can look for ways to spend more revenue on things that are excluded from the GAN limit, like infrastructure, like emergency spending. And at the same time, they can also make changes to our tax credit policy. And we at the Budget Center, of course, there are lots of tax credits in the world, including tax credits going to businesses that don't need them. But we at the Budget Center would recommend, if we're going to do tax credits as a way of addressing the GAN limit, let's do tax credits that are going to help families that need that assistance the most right now. So there are narrow opportunities right now this year for advocates with budget asks, right? Proposals that address the GAN limit, right? You can legitimately go to the budget folks in the Capitol and say, we have an idea that addresses the GAN limit. Those are going to have an advantage. So for example, if you go with an infrastructure project, housing, childcare facilities, some other type of capital outlay, that's a plus. If you have spending that legitimately addresses an emergency, such as the COVID-19 pandemic ongoing, right? That is a plus. That is a way of signaling that, yes, this is an opportunity to spend money in a way that is exempt from the GAN limit. Or if you have a tax credit idea, for example, I mentioned earlier the Cal EITC and the Young Child Tax Credit expansion options, right? But not everything can be a tax credit, right? We can't solve all the problems of the world through tax credits. It works in some cases, it doesn't work in other cases. Now, if you have a proposal that doesn't fit into any of these boxes, meaning they're not addressing GAN limit requirements, or they're not GAN friendly, so to speak, then you're going to face some substantial obstacles. That doesn't mean that your idea will not be approved, doesn't have a chance at all. There's always a way that folks in the legislature and the governor's office can make things work. There's always wiggle room. So there can be pathways to success for some of these ideas that don't necessarily check the GAN limit box, right? But it's just going to be much more difficult to push those kinds of ideas through this year, especially if they have significant price tags. It's just going to be much harder for the legislature and the governor to accommodate those kinds of budget requests this year. And as we know, the governor's May revision is coming out within a couple weeks, and that means this year's budget is going to be pretty much wrapped up within the next 4 to 5 weeks. So it's coming fast. So looking ahead, our basic position at the Budget Center is that there is no room in California's future for the GAN limit. We consider it to be a roadblock to creating a more equitable California because it limits state leaders to a narrow range of budget choices when revenues are expected to exceed the spending cap. It constrains our ability to maintain current services and to invest in bold policy solutions. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, it works at cross purposes with other constitutional formulas like Prop 98 and Prop 2 in a way that could further squeeze state support for vital services. So there are some options to deal with the GAN limit. Really, we're talking about reforming or repealing the GAN limit. And because it's in the state constitution and was put there by the voters back in 1979, this would require another vote of the people. But as many of you already know, the legislature has the ability to place constitutional amendments on the ballot. It just requires a 2/3 vote of the Assembly and a 2/3 vote of the Senate. Doesn't even need the governor's signature. The legislature on its own with supermajorities can put constitutional amendments before the voters. There is some talk in Sacramento about the possibility of this happening in 2024. It's too late for this year, but there may be ways to hold the budget together with duct tape, right, over the next couple of years, and then ask the voters for a fix in 2024. What could we ask them to do? Well, one is we could just go to them and say, please, just repeal this. Just take it out of the state constitution. Not sure if voters would go for that. That's why there's going to be a lot of focus group testing. There's going to be a lot of efforts to test the waters here over the next year or so. What would voters be likely to go for in terms of changing the GAN limit? The other opportunity would be to reform it in a way that gives policymakers more flexibility to make budget choices. So we wouldn't be going to the voters asking them for a full repeal, but we'd be asking them for some type of reform that would loosen up the GAN limit. And then, of course, we at the Budget Center feel that any solution that goes to the voters also needs to address the relationship among these various constitutional formulas, GAN, Prop 98, Prop 2, to ensure that they are working together rather than at cross purposes, because that is one of the big dangers that the state budget faces, which I mentioned earlier, which is that we are going to have more obligations toward these constitutional formulas than we actually have revenue coming in to pay for them because they are working at cross purposes. So we think it's important to address the GAN limit because it would allow the state to support current services and also to make the bold investments that are needed for all Californians to be healthy and thrive. So that ends my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm not sure if we have time for questions, but if we do, I'm happy to stick around and see if anyone has any right now. And as I mentioned earlier, you should always feel free to get in touch with me later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I agree. Thanks, Scott. As always, you try to break down the incredibly complicated into bite-sized pieces for us. And once again, I think you succeeded on what has probably been the most challenging one yet to break down for us. And the GAN limit is something that we are facing right now in any type of investments for the disability community. So thanks for addressing this super important and kind of wonky, right, topic, but thank you. And I think we have time for a couple questions, and I know there are several questions. So let's see if we can get those up. From Harry Brule, Scott, do you think it is feasible to consider funds that the state expends to be in compliance with a federal HCBS rule to be excluded from the GAN limit? So can the GAN limit be expenses be excluded if it's complying with a federal law?
That's an interesting question. So one thing I didn't mention was that the GAN limit also allows the state to exclude from the spending cap expenditures that are required by a court order or by the federal government. So it seems like, so I guess that is the case you would have to make. I don't have an easy answer for you off the top of my head, but I think you'd have to be able to make a case that without this federal mandate, if it's a mandate, California would not otherwise be doing this. So if we really are doing it only because the feds told us we have to, then it seems like it would fall into that mandate category and the spending would not count toward the GAN limit. That's my best effort at an off the top of my head answer. So feel free to follow up if that didn't quite hit the mark.
That's fair. That's definitely fair. Time for at least one more. Does GAN impact the current request to escalate wage increases for direct support professionals? A 10% wage increase slated for this month is not enough to make a difference in the shortage.
I would say yes, if only because any expenditure that cannot be excluded from the GAN limit then becomes a quote problem in the budget, right? Because we may not have the ability to fund, even though we have a lot of revenues coming in, right? They have gone above the line, and therefore we can only use them for things that Paul Gann says is okay. And Paul Gann does not favor spending like wage increases. It is not privileged in the GAN limit. And so that would be a problem. Yes.
Hey, Jordan,
Yeah.
can I ask a question?
Please, yeah. We'll finish with you.
If Paul Gann doesn't want to spend the money, can you come and see how value our services are? Because in order for him to know the difficulties that we face every year on a daily basis, and he would have to step in our shoes. So I don't care how we have to do it, but the GAN thing really needs to have an overall reform, because it doesn't work. And you said it was back in 1970. Well, this is 2022. It doesn't work. We need to get rid of it. And we need to come up with something that works for everyone. And maybe that means changing the Constitution a little bit. Because unless you have a disability, you don't know how hard it is to live with a disability on a day-to-day basis. So,
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, and maybe Scott, I know we're short on time, but is there any movement that you can talk of? Liz was saying, we got to change this, even if it's in the Constitution. Is there any movement that you know of to do so?
We got to change it. You're absolutely right. I really appreciate that comment. A movement, not right now. The Budget Center is making an effort soon to convene advocates across a range of policy areas, including folks from, representing Californians with developmental disabilities. So we're not necessarily leading the charge, but the first thing that all advocates need to do is to understand why the GAN limit is a problem, talk about it with their own networks, figure out how to organize around a possible solution. I think we're going to be hearing more from folks here in Sacramento in the Capitol on how to address this next year and maybe early 2024. They're the ones who are going to be doing the digging, and everyone wants to know, what do Californians right now as a whole probably don't understand much about the GAN limit and haven't heard much about it. So we're going to have to help to define it, to explain why it's a problem, and to persuade Californians that it is harmful to our future, right? I think that's the point that was just being made. It's very damaging. It doesn't work if we want a California where everyone can be healthy and thrive. There's no reason why we have to live with arbitrary rules set back in 1979. So that is the work of advocates over the next couple of years to build the movement to either repeal or significantly reform the GAN limit.
Scott, thank you so much for being with us. As always, a frequent attender and presenter at our annual conference. So thank you again. We are always appreciative of your ability to break this down for us.
Thank you. I appreciate the invite, and good luck with the rest of your conference.
Thanks so much, Scott.